latest around the wide world of tropics. Tropical Weather Bulletin for September 4th. Coming out a bit late tonight, but either way we've still got it, and we've only got two systems active: Hurricane Larry, which continues to intensify in the Atlantic, now at Category 2, and 17W, which is practically already dead. 61 storms have formed so far this year as we enter day 247. Going into the Atlantic, there is day 95 here of hurricane season in the Atlantic, and there is of course Hurricane Larry, a Category 2 expected to become a Category 4 soon, and 91L, which could see some development in the western Gulf of Mexico in the coming days. Moving on over to the Eastern Pacific, we don't have an area of interest marked here, but there is something that the National Hurricane Center has a medium chance of development. It is likely that we could be seeing something marked here tomorrow night. But until then, that is not the case, at least for now. Moving on over to the Western Pacific, you can see 17W on the top right of the map there. Of course, it is going to die out soon enough in terms of its circulation. There's also Invest 94W, which still has a 50% chance of formation as it heads towards the northern Philippines, or slightly north of that as well. Should recurve soon enough after that as well. In the North Indian Ocean, there's nothing going on here, and no development expected in the next 5 days. Of course, we're now in September, and we could be seeing the second peak of the season coming in about a month or so. So, moving on over to the North Atlantic satellite imagery, you can quite clearly see Larry there, of course. Been popping out an eye in the last few hours there, and it looks like it's going to be staying cleared out for quite some time. A long-lived hurricane track is expected, and you can kind of see 91L there in the Yucatan Peninsula currently. In the Eastern Pacific, not really much going on here. It's relatively quiet, just some convective activity going on, but nothing that's really going to be getting itself together at the moment here. Any development's probably not going to be until the next 4 or 5 days. Moving on over to the Western Pacific, we're looking at not much going on here. 17W pretty much just died, and behind it is of course 94W, and it's kind of hard to discern where the center is. Could become something in the long term, but as of right now it's got some work to do before it eventually gets there. That is why we have that as a 50% chance of formation. Moving on over to the North Indian Ocean satellite imagery, that'll be coming up here in just a second. There it is, and the monsoonal activity continues. Of course, that little feature that we had in the Arabian Sea has basically been shredded at this point, pretty much leaving everything to go back to what I usually see every night, where the monsoon season is just continuing. And there's the floater of the continued organization of Larry here. It's getting itself really good in terms of its activity, and it seems that for some reason the imagery is slightly outdated here, but it's been getting its eye much more apparent over the last few hours, and it's looking a lot better in the grand scheme of things. So of course Category 4 currently expected out of this. Here are the sea surface temperatures in the Eastern Pacific, and you can see that most of the temperatures are over 30 degrees Celsius have receded into the Gulf of California. The rest of the sea surface temperatures there being around 28 to 29. The impact Grace had is nearly faded away now, although of course you can still see the impacts Ida had on the sea surface temperatures in the eastern Gulf of Mexico. The western Gulf, however, remains around 30 to 32 degrees Celsius. Elsewhere in the Atlantic, it remains around 28 to 29 throughout the majority of the bays, and some areas near the Cape Verde Islands still around 27. In the North Indian Ocean, we're starting to see some of the 30 degrees Celsius expand and cross the Bay of Bengal there, and as you head into the Arabian Sea, well, it's still remaining quite a bit of a issue there with the sea surface temperatures. In the Western Pacific, we're looking at the 30 degrees isotherms continuing across the Philippine Sea, the South China Sea, and of course all the bays, and remains around 28 to 29 degrees Celsius in its entirety. The southern hemisphere remaining, of course, rather cool. Moving on over to the sea surface temperature anomalies, of course we are seeing those La Nina conditions continue to develop here. The Atlantic remains warmer than average in its entirety, except for where Ida tracked over. Western Pacific, same story, and then of course we're looking at the Eastern Pacific not faring too well with cooler temperatures, or just around average. Well, on this day in 2007, we had Hurricane Felix peaking as a Category 5 before making landfall on the Nicaragua coastline. There was also Hurricane Henriette, a different one compared to what we had on last night's TWB, and there was also Typhoon Fito in the Western Pacific. Had quite the interesting track, needless to say. Of course, Felix was one of 2 Category 5s that took a similar track throughout the Caribbean in this very active season. So List 3, or List 5 I should say, is something that we've been watching have some very interesting seasons when it comes to Cat 5s. Of course, you can find them powered by Cyclone History. Well, here we are. The next name in the Atlantic is Mindy and Nicholas. Of course, we've only used these names once before in 2003. In the Eastern Pacific, the next 2 names here are Olaf and Pamela. And in the Central Pacific, it may take the luring noise of a Shrexophone from Shrek in order to get Hone in the coming days. Although, of course, we don't have access to that kind of stuff. In the Western Pacific, the next 2 names here are Kansan followed by Chantu. And in the North Indian Ocean, we're looking out for Gulab and Shaheen. Moving over to the Southern Hemisphere, specifically the Southwestern Indian Ocean, the next 2 names here are Anna followed by Betsy Ray. In the Australian region, we're looking out for Patty and Ruby. And in the South Pacific, it is Cody. We'll be back for another Tropical Weather Bulletin tomorrow night.